Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of the interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. My name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR, and I'm presenting today on behalf of Joe, who had a scheduling conflict. A couple notes about today's webinar. All participants are muted. You can utilize the question chat field or dashboard at any point throughout the presentation to go ahead and type in your questions, and we will save the questions for the end of the presentation. You can also access the slides for the webinar through PJR's website, as well as a recording of today's webinar, which will be posted to PJR's YouTube page linked to our website. This webinar and other past webinars can be accessed the same way. So you can go to our website and visit previously recorded webinars specifically to find that information. This slide represents an overview of topics to be covered during today's webinar. I'll give a little bit of background related to the subject of the webinar. We will cover some ISO 9001-2015 related requirements. We'll discuss what a process is, as well as what a process is not. And then we'll share some strategies for meeting the interaction of process requirement with minimal changes to your existing documentation. As I mentioned, we'll start off with some background information here on this concept of the interaction of process, or the IOP. It's not a new requirement in the standard by any means. In 2014, PJR was faced with a mandate from our accreditation body, or our AB, to take a harder line on our enforcement and our assessment of the IOP requirement in the standard. So holding our clients accountable to meeting this requirement in a more stringent manner than we had been before. PJR is held accountable to a variety of requirements as a certification body. Some of those can be found in ISO 17000-2001-2015 or 17021-2015. In that document specifically, you'll find a clause that reads, "An audit program for the full certification cycle shall be developed to clearly identify the audit activity or activities required to demonstrate that the client's management system fulfills the requirements for certification." So the clause does go on from there, but that's the relevant portion to our requirement to assess clients against the interaction of process and use it for the audit program or the audit planning processes. So PJR is accordingly expected to ensure that our auditors are performing accordingly and documenting the audits that they perform in a way that reflects the client's management system. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about the interaction of processes, the client's definition of what their processes are. That's how we formulate our audit program to show over the audit cycle and the period of certification that we are auditing appropriately, covering all of those applicable processes to cover the whole management system throughout the cycle. Where this gets a little difficult is when the interaction of process needs to be used to complete the audit report if the interaction of processes is not effectively communicating what those processes are. So our policy is to follow the client's interaction of processes exactly and to utilize that for the audit report, for the audit package, the audit program, the audit plan, for example, as well as the audit report, even the categorization of nonconformities. It's also used in our audit planning process called the audit program that we create to show how all of the processes will be sampled over the course of the audit cycle. So again, our policy is to adhere to the client's interaction of processes. So if that document or series of documents don't effectively identify and communicate what those processes are, this makes it really hard for the auditor. We've instructed our auditors to issue nonconformities in instances where the client's IOP, interaction of processes, does not identify processes in an appropriate manner. And that's the reason for this particular webinar, to go into some of those common pitfalls and give you some helpful guidance on what it is we're looking for and how you can better meet this requirement. In ISO 9001-2015, we have here some cited mandates where the organization is required to identify those processes and demonstrate their interaction. So this is really where this requirement to have the interaction of processes comes from. In clause 4.4.1, it states the organization shall determine the processes needed for the quality management system. In 4.4.1b, it states that the organization shall determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. And in 4.4.2, it states the organization shall maintain documented information to support the operation of its processes. So combined, these require the organization determine its processes as part of the quality management system. What processes make up the system? What are the necessary processes? Once the processes have been determined, the organization also has to determine their sequence and interaction, how they interrelate to each other to result in the services or activities or products part of the quality management system, the scope, how the processes relate together to complete that scope. And then the last bullet point requires documented information as evidence. So not only is it required that you determine what the processes are and how they interrelate, but also have evidence of that determination that you can show an auditor. And that's where that documentation comes into play. ISO 9001-2015 defines a process as a set of interrelated or interacting activities that use inputs to deliver an intended result. The key portion of this definition is interrelated or interacting activities. This establishes a key aspect of what a process is not. It's not a single step, but it is a series of activities focused on a shared goal. So as I mentioned, the processes will interact or interrelate to help achieve the goal of the management system, which might be to produce a certain product or provide a given service, whatever the case may be, and this would vary widely by organization and industry. The following are some examples of what an acceptable process designation might be, or some examples of common processes: sales, purchasing, production, shipping, design and development. These are just a couple of examples, and remember that the interaction of processes is to reflect what the client identifies as its processes. So what you think your processes are. It does not need to match this list by any means. Every organization and industry is different. These are just a couple of examples to get you started. If you understand your quality management system to be made up of 4 processes, such as sales, purchasing, production, and support, that's completely acceptable, and your IOP should reflect as much. So again, it's about what you think your processes are. The interaction of process documents that get rejected are most often because they present steps within a single process. So they're not necessarily looking at the system as a whole and identifying all of the processes and how they interrelate. They're perhaps focusing on one single process, such as a production or an equivalent, and breaking down the individual steps it takes to achieve that one process. So an example would be listing what you perceive to be processes as create the work order, issue the production schedule, complete the work order, package the product, and ship the product. But that doesn't give us the full view of the entire system. So using this as an example of an incomplete designation, it's conceivable that all 5 of these steps are part of a single process, but they're not necessarily processes by themselves. An interaction of processes, or an IOP, that presents sections from the applicable standard as the organization's process would also be a concern. So we're not looking for your interaction of processes to mirror the breakdown of the standard, calling out those clauses as processes. That wouldn't be appropriate either. And we see this pretty commonly, such as resource management as listed as a process on a client's IOP, because that verbiage can be found within the standard. Same with monitoring and measurement being listed as a process. An IOP document that bears such items as processes would result in a nonconformance during the audit based on this guidance that we have provided to our auditors to help clients work towards effectively meeting the IOP requirements in the standard. Okay, so we'll talk about some strategies for meeting this requirement without having to completely overhaul your current documentation. So first and foremost, we recognize that for many of our clients, they have already put a lot of thought and consideration into developing their IOP. So this feedback might not necessarily be most welcome. We're also aware that many of our clients are somewhat disconcerted by being told that a portion of their quality system that has previously been accepted during audits, their IOP, is suddenly now not acceptable and resulting in a nonconformity. That doesn't feel good, and it can be very confusing. And again, this is part of the reason we offer this webinar on such a reoccurring basis, on a regular basis, to make this information very accessible. So we can certainly feel for clients in this situation and how frustrating it may seem, but we can present some different examples here and show that, again, we're not expecting a complete overhaul of your documentation. You can usually take your existing IOP and align it with the requirements of the standard by just making a couple small tweaks, and that's what we're going to focus on with the remainder of our time today. So we're going to look at an example and improve it together. We're going to look at an example of an IOP that was not taken from a client. This was formulated specifically for the purposes of this webinar, and look at some ways that we can improve it. First, we'll look at the raw interaction of processes. And again, this is not reflective of any PJR client. This is just an example. So here's our example interaction of processes. It has a lot of processes on here, some of which might not necessarily be processes in and of themselves, but maybe steps or activities within a process. So this is where we're starting, and we'll make some improvements to this interaction together. The first thing that we would improve, would be to identify and pull out what would be considered support processes. So this is a common reason for having your IOP document be rejected. If it lacks a specific place to identify or congregate what many companies have and would be considered support processes. It's important to note that ISO 9000 and ISO 9001 don't draw any particular distinctions between classification of processes. However, distinguishing between key processes or core processes compared to support processes is a very common concept. So as a result, many of the items that are categorized as support processes or management type processes are commonly left off of the interaction of processes. And then again, we're not getting a full view or a full understanding of the system's processes. Such items or examples might include the management review process, the internal audit process, training processes, corrective actions. That's not an all-inclusive list, but gives you a couple examples. So we're going to apply the concept of the support processes to our example. And we would do that by combining them together. And since they are relevant to various parts of the system, they could be inputs to a variety of processes, or the processes outputs can serve as inputs to the support processes. We would use these general arrows to indicate that they relate to a variety of processes. They don't necessarily fit in one specific part of a linear timeline. And just a reminder, we are going to save questions for the end. So you don't need to raise your hand. You can type your questions into the question field, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So again, with this example, we've added support processes to the interaction of processes to give a broader view of all of the relevant processes and how they interrelate. Excluding the support processes or management processes is a common error or reason for rejection or nonconformity against the interaction of process requirement in the standard. The next improvement we can make is to create a key for the interaction of processes. This is a very popular strategy. Again, this is just one example, but this is a popular strategy for the issue of having an existing interaction of processes that is now being brought up as a nonconformity or weaknesses being pointed out, and not wanting to overhaul the documentation. So instead of recreating the whole document or recreating the wheel, you can in some cases add a key to the existing documentation to help more effectively convey what the core or key processes are. And again, that would enable the interaction of processes to mostly stay as it is. But again, it would serve as this improvement to more effectively communicate what the core processes are. So we will apply this improvement to the example as well. So instead of removing processes or steps and overhauling the documentation, you can keep it the way it is. And in this case, the key uses a color coding system to group steps into their representative process and call out what those processes would be called based on your understanding of your system. So from this original example, we now have key processes of sales and order entry, purchasing, production, shipping, quality, and support. And again, these are only a couple examples of what those support processes may include. This will vary by industry, just as the core process names will vary by industry. So you can see how these are two pretty small changes that have a big impact to this document without having to restructure the IOP example or remove process or activities. If you want to keep it as more of a material flow diagram, this is a very effective way to improve the document and meet the IOP requirements. So by making these two small adjustments, we have a much better or a much stronger interaction of processes. It identifies what the company's processes are and also now reflects the support processes and how they fit into the interaction. And this would be much more appropriate for an audit and to avoid a nonconformity in this subject. It also helps the auditor more effectively capture those process names within the audit package and for the audit program planning purposes. Again, that was just one example. There are multiple ways to achieve this concept and meet the requirements of the standard. We've seen many different methods over the years, and again, this is not the only way an IOP could be accepted. So we will use the time that we have left to share some additional examples, give you some other ideas. If you are looking to overhaul your documentation, give you some other examples in order to effectively communicate the determination of processes and their interaction to meet those requirements of ISO 9001:2015. So here's an example where you can see the process names such as contracts, purchasing, engineering, production scheduling, and then we have, again, the support process grouped. This example has a couple processes that we didn't get a chance to mention earlier. Training may be part of the support process, calibration, customer satisfaction assessments or inputs and outputs would be relevant. Feedback mechanisms, quality objectives would be relevant. Document and record controls would be relevant. And those are the types of things that don't, again, fit into this linear process because they interact with most, if not all, of the processes. All of the processes would have employees and personnel within the processes that have training requirements, competency requirements, the need for training, evidence of training, training records, verification of training effectiveness, concepts like that that would apply to all of the processes as personnel can be spread across those different processes. Here's another example. It looks different, but still calls out the core processes and then some management type processes included here, showing that they interact with a variety of processes. This has some different names of processes. Again, this varies so much by industry and organization. We see quoting here, we see receiving inspection, we see overhaul, some examples that we didn't see in some of the other examples. This format is even another example, more of a swim lane model where the individual rows represent the actual processes. You can see them here on the left: sales, purchasing, production, and support, and then showing specific activities within those processes and how they interrelate. One interesting thing about this model would be how, for example, sales and purchasing are separate processes. They begin on their own. They don't necessarily trigger each other, but they do converge several steps later when it comes to the issuance of work orders, and then serve as an input to the production process, beginning with injection molding. So this is another visual representation of how the processes interact. Here's another example that includes some color coding. Instead of grouping the processes, this example takes perhaps what was a material flow or their previous version of the IOP that, again, without the color coding, it would be difficult to understand what the core processes were. Certainly not all of these individual boxes would be considered key or core processes. So they have added color coding here to highlight which are the core processes, and then clarifies that the remaining boxes not highlighted in yellow would combine to establish or represent the support process. So this is another example. Again, we're seeing internal audit, corrective action, control of non-conforming product would be a support process, calibration again, control of documents and records, and training. Okay, so just to conclude before we get to questions, PGR certainly wants to ensure that we provide our clients with a value-added audit while also meeting all those applicable audit criteria and standard requirements and the requirements that we're held to as a certification body. So we talked about that earlier in the presentation, how we need to take a more firm stance on implementing and holding our clients to this interaction of processes requirement, making sure it meets those standard requirements that we quoted earlier. And also, the stronger the IOP is, the easier it is for the auditor to have the report and the audit plan and the audit programming accurately reflect the IOP as we are advising them to do or requiring them to do. The stronger the IOP, the easier it is for the auditor to utilize that for all of those purposes. And again, we're not looking for you to have to overhaul your documentation if it's not effectively meeting the requirements of those interaction of processes criteria at this time. We're hoping that this webinar and these examples will help you to make some small tweaks, some small changes to go ahead and be in conformance with those requirements moving forward. It's also our hope that the webinar today and this presentation offers a clearer understanding for our clients of what constitutes a process, and conversely, what does not constitute a process. Okay, let's take a look at what, if any, questions we have. Okay, our first question is, do support processes include calibration? Yes, certainly they can include calibration. I think the first example we looked at did not include calibration specifically, but some of the subsequent examples did include calibration. In some cases, depending on the industry, calibration could be its own standalone process. If that's part of the service you provide, if you perform calibrations or offer calibrations as part of your processes. But if it's a support process, maintaining the little bit of calibration that is needed for you to create your products or maintain your processes, such as calibrating gauges or some measurement equipment in the lab, then that would be more relevant as a support process rather than a core process. Can we have a copy of the slides? Yes, as I mentioned, the slides will be available for download on PJR's website, and a recording of the webinar will also be linked to the web from the website to our YouTube page. You can go ahead and check out previously recorded webinars. The next question says, some companies are looking at the chart flow you presented as a task, and the tasks are inside of the processes like sales, 1, enter the customer's order in the system, 2, print the order, 3, send to the manufacturer. Is this type of vision correct? So I think what I'm understanding from your question is whether it's acceptable to have specific task items within a process. Certainly if that is value added for your organization, again, if your IOP document is currently more of a process flow chart or a material flow chart that has those specific tasks, that's not necessarily something you need to remove. If you're being told by your auditor through a nonconformity, for example, that your IOP does not effectively communicate the core processes, then using some of the examples we showed, you may need to group them into what those core processes are, add a key, for example, or color code, or that swim lane example that had the activity, the breakdown of specific tasks categorized into rows with that specific core process name called out on the left-hand side. There's multiple ways that you can facilitate that clarification while still including what those specific tasks might be. And again, you can go back in the slides and take a closer look at some of the examples we showed and different methodologies for doing that. We have a question about whether the support box has to connect to the other boxes on the flowchart. So we saw several different examples of the support or management process in its own box with some arrows. In some of the examples, we can even go back, I believe. Using this example, you can see that the arrows are pointing to the general direction of all of the processes, but not necessarily touching each box. It still conveys that the support processes apply to the whole system. Similarly, this example also does not touch each box, but is meant to convey all of the processes by having this general arrow that points to the general direction of all of them. Here we have more specifically an arrow pointing at each box, which is more geared towards your question, does it have to connect to all the other boxes? This is a little bit clearer, but not everyone likes to play around with this many arrows. So this is just another way of showing that same concept. And here again, we have arrows just generally pointing in the direction of all of the other processes. So this is an acceptable way to show that those support processes apply to the whole system. And if you have another idea of how you'd like to do that, that could be acceptable as well. Next question we have, what are examples of a nonconformity in an IOP? I'm not sure I totally understand that question. So the auditor can issue a nonconformity against the clause that we referenced earlier in the presentation as to where in the standard this requirement can be found. So the nonconformity would cite one of those clauses if there is an issue with the IOP, such as the original example we looked at. So let me just go back here. The original example we showed had, let's see, it was missing support processes, and it listed several processes that may or may not be standalone processes within and of themselves. Maybe they are tasks within a process. So the nonconformity could be cited against the applicable clause with some information in the objective evidence to specify what about the interaction of processes was insufficient. In this case, again, the lack of support process, representation on the interaction of processes, and an ineffective communication of what the key processes would be might be an example of the nonconformity issued for this particular example. The next question is whether or not the support processes have to be displayed on the flowchart. So just to clarify too, the interaction of processes does not necessarily have to be a flowchart. A visual representation is a very common example, but we do even see some companies do a really good job of explaining the processes in just text form. Maybe somewhere in their manual they have an explanation of what their processes are. And then in lieu of this visual representation with the arrows showing how they interact, they may have a paragraph, a description of how that process interrelates with the other processes. So it doesn't even necessarily need to be a flowchart. I don't have any specific examples of such an example in this webinar from Joe. But yes, support processes do need to be included in the interaction of processes to show how those support processes, the management review, the training, those different management or support functions fit into the system overall. If it were just production, sales, purchasing, and shipping, we would be missing that whole piece about how the personnel are trained, how the outputs of the effectiveness of those processes is an input to the internal audit process, or how customer satisfaction feeds back into improvements in the system and the associated corrective actions. It would be an incomplete view of all of the processes needed to meet the requirements of the standard. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. We have another question about how the diagram of an IOP helps an organization to do their business better. So the requirement to have the interaction of processes is a requirement of the standard. So if you're pursuing certification to ISO 9001, obviously you know you need to meet all the requirements of the standard in order to obtain and maintain that certification. So first and foremost, if you're looking for ISO 9001, you need to meet the requirements of the standard, whether it has a direct, profound impact on your ability to do business or not. You are making the choice to pursue that voluntary standard as an organization and thus have to meet those requirements. However, the interaction of processes, whether you utilize a diagram or a detailed description within your documentation, some other way of showing that evidence that you have determined your processes and how they interrelate, can certainly be beneficial to your operation in terms of planning your internal audit. For example, it would give you the full breadth of the system and all of the processes and how they interrelate to make sure your internal audit has covered the entire program or the entire management system. For someone who is newer to the organization, it certainly gives a snapshot as to how those processes interrelate. Same with certain types of visitors or contractors who might find that information valuable. If you are outsourcing your internal audits or some of your other work, again, this interrelationship between the core processes, how they relate to one another and how they work together to achieve the requirements of the system could certainly be beneficial. That's just a couple examples off the top of my head. So we have some feedback here about this concept not necessarily being applied across the board, across all audits. Certainly, we are always interested in continual improvement. I'd be glad to pass that feedback on. We continue to train our auditors, update our auditor training as well as the audit documentation to push our auditors to audit to these requirements. And we also review our packages to ensure that they are holding our clients accountable to the given requirements. So I'll certainly pass that feedback along and make sure that we continue to try and improve in that area. We have a question about the difference between a process and a step for someone who may not have a lot of QMS experience. So I would go back to the definition of what a process is. Let me see if I can quickly find that in the slides. And this is not found in the 9001 standard, but in the ISO 9000 standard, which supports the 9001 standard. So I would refer to 9001, the 9000 standard, excuse me, for some further support in that area. So the definition of a process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities that use inputs to deliver an intended result. So the steps or the activities interrelate to create a process or to work together to represent a process, but the individual steps don't necessarily equate to a process in and of themselves. So again, take a look at these couple of slides that we discussed in that area, how they need to establish what a process is and what it is not, some examples of what processes might be and what processes might not be. Again, we have here on this slide about how some of these individual steps together form a process but are not processes in and of themselves. Preventive action is not addressed in ISO 9000 2015 standard, but it's addressed as a process. I don't remember specifically saying preventive action. Let me go back to the examples that we have and see if I can see what you're referring to. Let's see. Everywhere I remember in Joe's examples had corrective actions. Okay, so I see right here, corrective preventive action. This could be outdated from the 2015 version, but we also do still see a lot of clients continue to use that concept for continual improvement purposes. And even in some of the standards where the term preventive action is not called out specifically, there is a very clear tone of proactivity and continual improvement. Preventive action is a great example of how that can be captured. You're not being proactive if you are reacting to something. If there was an incident or even a near miss, which counts as an incident, you're not being proactive by addressing that. That would be considered a corrective action. However, if you are truly identifying something before it becomes an issue, before there has been any type of incident, that would be preventative, that would be proactive in nature. And this is still a very common tool to be utilized. Okay, we have another question. Does PJR offer hypothetical examples of a process-approached internal audit, including a process-approached audit questionnaire? No, we don't offer those types of documentation examples. That would be more on the consulting side. That would be sort of crossing a line for us as auditors to supply that information. But as I mentioned, a good, an effective interaction of processes would be an appropriate tool or a helpful tool for the internal audit process to support the audit planning, to make sure all of the processes are accounted for and it's a full system audit. Do inputs and outputs of each process have to be shown on the interaction of process diagram? So in relation to this question, this relates to the second bullet point about where in the standard this requirement can be found. So it's not enough to identify what the processes are. You're also required to determine their sequence and their interaction. So if you're putting them in a linear order, you have the sequence piece, but not the interaction. How they interrelate, what aspects of one process may feed into another, that's the interaction. So the inputs and outputs is one way of meeting this requirement, showing how they interact. In the service industry, is a machine processing material? Can the individual machine be a process, or does it have to be production or manufacturing? The machine has its own input and output. So again, the process determination is ultimately up to the organization, what you think your processes are. But again, take a close look at the definition for what a process is and what a process is not. If even given the review of that information, you feel a specific machine is a significant enough part of your system that it substantiates its own process, that could potentially be the case. I can't think of a good example of that off the top of my head, but I don't want to say that across the board that would not be acceptable. SWOT analysis will be a part of management meeting sessions or could be included as a KPI. I am not sure how that relates to this webinar. Feel free to submit your question via email, or if you have time and you're still on here, if you could rephrase that so I can understand how to help you better. Thank you. I have another question that's not completely clear, something about the support process called as IOP. So again, support processes are relevant to inclusion in the IOP. I'm just not sure I understand that question. I apologize. Do you include the questions response time with previously recorded webinars? Yes, the question and answer session at the end of the webinar is included in the recording, so you can go back and review questions that other people might have had as well. So this seems like a follow-up question to what the benefits of the IOP are for the business. Kind of making an argument that this seems like administrative paperwork, just additional work instead of value added. Joe may be better equipped to answer that. Again, he typically does the webinar. Besides the examples I already provided, I'm having a hard time thinking of additional examples off the top of my head. I'm more focused on EHS in my line of doing the EHS department. However, I'm sure Joe would have multiple examples of how the IOP specifically is value added for a quality management system beyond the several examples I already provided. There's a question asking for a case study. I don't have a case study. We provided a specific example in this webinar looking at an example that would have been deemed non-conforming and making 2 key changes to it to improve it and yield an acceptable interaction of processes. Beyond that, I don't have a specific case study. If you have specific questions, you can reach out to us at PJR and we can talk through what your questions might be. Why is processing an order not considered a process? It could be. It depends on your organization, how you group your processes, what those activities look like, what the outputs of your system are. Are you providing a service? Are you manufacturing a product? It really depends. Processing can mean so many different things for so many different organizations and industries. That would really depend on what you mean by that. Again, if it's not that individual job activity breakdown where you're taking a specific activity instead of a process as a whole and trying to pass it off as a process of its own, then it could potentially be acceptable. Processing an order is in some ways equivalent to manufacturing an order or manufacturing a product. So again, depending on the flow of events or what your specific scope of certification is, it could potentially be a process. I just can't answer that across the board. We would have to ensure that it's not more of an individual job task, but actually a process of its own. If effectiveness of training is missing, such as exams, is this considered a non-conformance if we only have training records and a training matrix? So again, I focus more on EHS. I don't typically do 9001 as a standalone. We're looking more at integrated audits that have quality as well as some of the EHS standards, which do specifically require a method for verifying training effectiveness. I seem to recall ISO 9001 having a similar requirement, but I would have to open the standard and refresh my memory on that. I would take a look at the competency requirements in the standard to understand whether that is a requirement. If it is found in 9001, which again, to be honest, off the top of my head, I don't recall, if it's a requirement in the standard and you don't have any evidence of training effectiveness, then it could, yes, certainly be, could constitute a nonconformity. If it's not in 9001, it's certainly a good practice, but it would not result in a nonconformity if it is not a requirement within the standard. Last question I see here, is there a link between KPIs and interaction of processes? Will the auditor review to see if the KPI makes sense to where the process is being measured? Makes sense to where in the process it is being measured. Is there a link between This might be a question that I have to put to Joe to give you an effective response. Certainly the KPIs, again, vary so much by industry and organization. If you have higher risk processes, you may see more KPIs related to those processes, how they specifically relate to the interaction of processes beyond being considered perhaps a support process, how the outputs of the processes might yield data as an input for the KPIs, the continual improvement process, the objectives, monitoring and measurement. Beyond that general concept, I would have to put that question to Joe. So feel free to either send an email to PJR or perhaps review some of the previously recorded webinars, or like I said, shoot Joe an email. I don't think he has his contact information on this. Let me. No, he didn't list it. So if you want, you can shoot me an email. Again, my name is Austin Matthews. So the email would be amatthews with 2 T's at pjr.com. And I can try and get some clarification from Joe and get back with you once I have your email address to respond to. Okay, I don't see any other questions for today. Thank you so much for joining us. There were a lot of good questions today. And again, the slides and a recording of the webinar will be made available on PJR's website. Have a great day.